let's get started. Good afternoon. My name is Stuart Stedman. I'm the chair of the board. It is now 3:02 p.m. and I'd like to call the September 10th special call board meeting to order. This meeting is being held via video conference. Please be aware that although we are meeting via video conference, this meeting is still being broadcast via the internet. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome those joining us via video and ask that they observe the following etiquette. Please state your name before you speak, mute your microphone when not speaking, and keep background noise to a minimum. Members, we will begin with a roll call to ensure we have a quorum. Mr. Campbell? Cody, are you on the call? Dr. Farias?
Present.
Mr. Raven?
Present.
Ms. Swartz?
I'm here.
Mr. Torn?
Here.
Ms. Williams?
Here.
Mr. Wilson?
Present.
Mr. McClaney?
Hi, I'm here.
Great.
And this is Cody Campbell. I'm here as well. Sorry
good.
about that. I was on mute.
Good. Welcome. Our members, please excuse the absence of Mr. Anwar, who's unable to join us today due to duties requiring his presence elsewhere. Let's see, item number 2 on the agenda is public testimony. We have not received any requests for public testimony, so we'll move on to agenda item 3. Agenda item 3 is matters relating to the full board. Item 3A is consideration of adopting the commissioner's recommendation to the board relating to the agency's legislative appropriation request for the fiscal years 2022 and 2023. Mr. Ken Martin, Assistant Commissioner, Financial Services and CFO, and Mr. Ray Rodriguez, Deputy Commissioner and Chief of Staff, will present this item and be available for questions. Mr. Martin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome members. This is, as the chairman mentioned, a discussion of the legislative appropriation request. This is for the fiscal year 2022 and 23 biennium. Let me take a couple step backs of why we submitted legislative appropriation request, or what I'm going to call the LAR. State funding for the Higher Education Coordinating Board is appropriated to the agency through the Biennial General Appropriations Act. This act is approved by the Texas legislature and eventually signed by the governor. Prior to the start of the legislative session, though, each state agency is required to develop an LAR. The LAR provides information to the governor and legislature about the agency's funding needs and priorities. The LAR starts with base level funding, then builds upon this with exceptional items the agency requests. And just to give you a little bit of background, base level funding is basically, as we're talking about 2022 and 23, base level funding is what we have in 20 and 21 from a general revenue and general revenue dedicated perspective. So call it flat funding, if you will, from one biennium to the next. The LAR base being presented today is aligned with the General Appropriations Act of the 86th legislature. So that's operating in this biennium, and includes a mandated 5% reduction in general revenue and general revenue dedicated. So we received a 5% mandated reduction in around June timeframe for the 2021 biennium, of which we're in right now. And then once we received our base from the Legislative Budget Board, that also contained a 5% reduction in it for the 22-23 fiscal year. The agency was mandated to reduce both biennia by 5%. Any funding desired above your base is required to be requested in the LAR through an exceptional item request, which we will talk about in greater detail in a moment. As you know, we typically approve our LARs in the July board meeting or for an early August submission. This year, because of budgetary uncertainty and other factors, instructions from the LBB were delayed. We received our instructions around August 19th, and around August 24th, we received our base. So that's our starting point, and that allowed us to begin. But it put us in a very compressed time frame to do so. The coordinating board, along with most state agencies and institutions of higher education, were directed to reduce its base funding by 5% for, again, as I mentioned, both biennium. It's important to note that the reductions I just mentioned are not cumulative. So we had our base of a fixed number We reduced 5% for this biennium. That base, that before the reduction, would carry over to next biennium, and of which we're required now to reduce that by 5%. So basically, it's making both biennium equal in dollar amounts. With that said, I will pass this over to Mr. Ray Rodriguez to talk a little bit about the reductions as well as our exceptional item requests that the agency is proposing.
Thank you, Ken. I'd like to quickly walk through the recommendations related to both the mandatory 5% reduction and the agency exceptional item requests. Mary, if you could go to the next slide, please. We engaged in a careful and thoughtful review of each program in developing recommendations to you about how to apply these reductions. Because most of the coordinating board's state appropriated funding is in trustee programs, the 5% reduction to FY22, FY23 base funding inevitably and substantially impacts major programs and operations important to students and families, institutions, and our state. More than 87% of the agency's funding is in just 5 programs, which include student financial aid programs and medical education related programs. Further, approximately 2% of the agency's appropriated funding supports agency administration. As this chart demonstrates, the scale of the largest programs lead us to recommend the full 5% reduction for these major programs in order to achieve our agency-wide reduction mandate. We are also recommending the agency's central administration strategy be cut by the full 5%, while programmatic administration is recommended for a 1% cut. For other smaller programs, including loan repayment programs, work study, and other financial aid programs, we were able to recommend smaller reductions. Our LAR instructions also require the agency to prioritize strategies for the preservation from reduction. We recommend prioritizing financial aid and medical education related programs to be the 2 most important categories to preserve. These programs are too large in scale not to reduce, but too important not to prioritize. It's important to note these recommendations to you regarding funding reductions are not made lightly. Commissioner Keller has been actively engaged in making the case that higher education should not be the release valve for the state's budget shortfalls, but rather an active partner in the state's economic recovery. Mary, next slide for exceptional item requests, please. Today, we're recommending for your approval targeted funding for key statewide and agency priorities through 5 exceptional item requests. First, we recommend the agency's highest priority exceptional item request be restoration of the 5% funding reductions. The majority of this exceptional item request, $57 million or 77%, would restore our major need-based financial aid programs to their FY 2021 appropriated levels. Second, we recommend the request of an additional $110 million in funding to support student financial aid. We know students and families impacted by the global pandemic are most dependent on the state's need-based student financial aid programs, and access to financial aid is a critical factor in determining whether students enroll, persist, and complete their higher education journey. Given the significant near-term economic uncertainty facing Texas students and their families, we recommend maintaining our commitment to need-based financial aid. Third, we recommend increasing the grad tech special item appropriation to $4 million to help scale our newly relaunched grad tech program. This program will re-engage adult learners and support them in completing high-value credentials. Again, making a contribution to the state's economic recovery. And lastly, we recommend $4 million. We recommend a $4 million request related to data security and accessibility, and a $1.2 million one-time request to cover costs associated with relocating the agency to the Capitol complex in 2022. I appreciate the opportunity to present these strategic recommendations today. I appreciate your consideration, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Members, do you have any questions?
One quick question, if I might. These exceptional item requests total, how do they compare to similar previous sessions and our exceptional item requests?
I'll take a first stab, and I think Ken might be able to give some better historical perspective. If you back away from our request to reinstate our 5% and our need to request funding to relocate downtown, we only have 3. The $110 million is to try to keep funding levels consistent with FY20 in terms of the proportion of students that are eligible who are actually receiving aid. So I think that this is less, significantly less than the agency last time around, because I think the number of items shrunk from 14 to 5. But I'll let Ken comment on, the difference in scale between the two submissions.
Yeah, Ray, I echo your same comments that from a quantity standpoint, the number of exceptional items is substantially lower. The commissioner and his staff and team wanted to be very tactical. As you know, each one of these requires legislative approval. So there's a little bit of discussion and trying to gain approval and support for these. So it's easier to have a smaller number. From a dollar perspective, as Ray mentioned, when you remove the 5%, we haven't had a budget reduction like this, I believe, since the last recession. I think it was around 2010-11 timeframe. So if you take that out, even from a dollar perspective, it's lower. And as you can see, the largest item there is the financial aid, the $110 million. And that's really, as Ray mentioned, to keep the scale as students grow and the number of students in that base, need-based financial aid, to try and make sure funding scales with them to provide them with the opportunity for the education, and the ultimate outcome is graduation and starting to provide economic input back to the state.
Does do we know these students that are getting this aid that we're trying to maintain, do we know where they are in the system, location-wise within the state?
No, sir. I believe that they would be spread throughout the state.
Right, but I mean, do we know where I'm headed is there are various legislators whose students in their area would benefit from this, and it might be a good strategy for us to have that information handy if asked, just to show to gain broad-based support, because at the end of the day, it's going to be a horse trade down to the finish. So
I understand, sir. I appreciate that comment.
Yeah, if I could make a comment, it may be just redundant, but just the way you describe the 110 million, I mean, it's a big number. But as I understand it, that is simply to maintain the current level of Texas grant and TEOG, and I guess TEG funding for the projected growth. In other words, same percentage of students, it's just capturing the projected growth in students. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's precisely correct.
Well, then I think that message needs to be sharpened, and you say it like that, as opposed to, well, to give everybody the opportunity or whatever. We're just trying to maintain the level of financial support statewide, given, a growing, state population and college or university and community college attendance. So anyway, just a comment, because the 110, in the face of budget, a budget crunch, sounds like a lot, but it's really just to keep to the 74 just kind of is a number that kind of keeps us, is a number from past years, but to capture the growth, the 110 is just keeps us exactly where we are. We're not really asking for more, and that's one difference, as I understand it, from past exceptional item requests, that we actually asked for more. This time, we're just trying to maintain the growth.
That is correct.
If I could weigh in, Mr. Chairman, I think that's a really critical point. That if without the 74, we're really starting way behind where we would be to be able to just maintain the current levels in the shares of eligible students who are able to access the need-based aid programs. And of course, the governor and legislative leadership help allocate one-time federal money so that we could offset potential 5% cuts in the last biennium. But going forward, we could potentially be starting 5% down from where we were in the last biennium. We would need the $74 million, 57 of which would be just to get back to even on the nominal investment in financial aid. But if we're gonna stay level in the proportion of students, if we're gonna stay level in the shares of students who are able to access aid, we'd actually need that additional 110 million.
And I have a question too. If this were a normal year and future years were normal, would this 110 million, which would be required to accommodate the growth, would that go into the base LAR for in the next year, to which then there would be an exceptional item request for the next bump up?
So it would depend on the instructions for that year and the priorities of leadership at the time. So there've been sort of different strategies that the House and Senate have taken. They usually try to be in sync as much as possible on the instructions for the LARs. Occasionally they've been different, but it really would depend. If we, of course, we would recommend and be delighted for the starting point to be let's at least maintain the proportion of students who are able to receive the major need-based aid programs.
Thank you.
This is Donna. I have a question.
Was somebody making a comment?
Donna, can you hear me?
Hi, Donna.
Hey, hi there. Given the environment that we're in with COVID-19 and everybody is competing for funds, have we thought about a plan B in case if we don't get all of the 110? How is it, what will the impact be for growth if we don't get the whole amount?
So I think, oh, sorry, Commissioner, please.
I was just the short answer is just fewer students would be able to access financial aid. And of course, where we are right now is that we have lots of folks who've lost their jobs, lots of families, financial situations have been adversely impacted by COVID. So the numbers of students who are going to need financial aid is going to increase. And so that's the context where we're having this conversation. And one of the reasons that just to stay even, the state would have to make an additional significant contribution and commitment to financial aid.
So to Stuart's point earlier, I think we need to articulate that in the argument that we're making up front, that the impact will be if, we don't get this. This is what, kids won't be able to go to school, more jobs won't be able to be had. I think we need to add that to the argument. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And really, I think the out of the gate, we're not being greedy here. We're just trying to maintain what we need to keep, you know, students in the pipeline and going to college.
And this is separate and apart from the GEAR funding and what that's supposed to, the gap that's supposed to fill. But that's again a one-time fund that won't help, you know, with longer-term economic downturns and issues.
That's absolutely correct.
Any other comments, questions? All right, well, thank you, Ken and Ray. May I have a motion to adopt the commissioner's recommendation to the board relating to the agency's legislative appropriation request for the fiscal years 2022, 2023?
So Emma will second.
So that's a motion by Mr. Raven, second by Ms. Swartz. Any further discussion? Members, when I call your name, please state your vote. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Mr. Campbell?
Sorry. Aye.
Dr. Frias?
Aye.
Mr. Raven?
Aye.
Ms. Swartz?
Aye.
Mr. Torn?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
And Ms. Williams?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. Motion passes. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
just a quick comment. You know, one of the things, maybe it's just a lawyer in me, but I think it's going to be critical that when we advocate for this LAR, that we have specific talking points that are made and that we raise critical questions about. Let those who are in power know that this is critical to maintaining where we've been and to try to help students who are going to be impacted by COVID. Is it possible that we can put together a list of talking points and questions that we raise to address these, so that we can kind of make sure that our message is consistent when we're talking to legislators and even to the governor's office about how important this is, that we don't want them to miss out on the critical basis for our proposal?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And actually, you know, what's missing in this discussion are numbers. You know, I mean, you know, the commissioner, you mentioned, well, you know, a bunch of kids won't be able to get financial aid. That's well, okay, well, how many? And then to Mr. Wilson's point, well, okay, how many and where are they? I mean, just sort of generally, what districts? But I think, Ricky, that's a great point, and we all need that, and really, you know, we need to kind of be comfortable with what the messaging is, because we need to be able to articulate that to legislators when we have the chance.
All right.
Mr. Raven will absolutely have that.
Yeah, I mean, I just believe that we have to, one of the things you have to do is you have to control your spend. And if you're not controlling your spend, I mean, it's tough to get people to join your movement. So just an FYI.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point. Let's see, next item 3B is the commissioner's report to the board on exceptions or modifications made pursuant to emergency rule section 1.15B. This item is for information only. Ms. Emily Cormier, Assistant Commissioner for Funding, will present this item and be available to answer questions. Ms. Cormier.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the board. I'm Emily Cormier. As you mentioned, I'll be presenting the Commissioner's report on actions taken under the emergency rule that was recently adopted. This is informational item only. On August 25th, the board met in a special called session and adopted an emergency rule to give the Commissioner flexibility in responding to institutional concerns during the COVID-19 pandemic. As we discussed at that meeting, this emergency rule was brought forward to address an issue raised by the institutions regarding our rules on distance education courses and their eligibility to be reported for formula funding. The emergency rule provided the Commissioner with the ability to modify reporting provisions for formula funding during times of disaster in the state And included in that rule was a provision that the commissioner then report back to the board on any actions taken. So since that time that we met, the commissioner has granted one modification under this authority, prompting this presentation, and that was pertaining to those distance education courses that we discussed at the last meeting. For background, our rules had prohibited courses from being reported for formula funding when they're taken by a non-resident student residing outside the state and only taking online courses. This rule provision was an issue this year as there are students who would typically be on campus, but who are instead not able to be in Texas due to the pandemic, and so may be only taking online courses from their home. And the reason that this is important is the courses reported during this summer and fall and coming spring provide the basis for an institution's formula funding appropriation from the legislature for the next 2-year biennium. Using the emergency rule, the commissioner granted a modification to remove the restriction on the reporting of these courses for students who are not able to be on campus due to the pandemic, starting with the summer semester. And this modification will enable us to include these courses in the data that we provide to the Legislative Budget Board, so it's available for the legislature when they meet in session to determine formula funding appropriations. That concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Hearing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item. Item 3C is consideration of approving the issuance of a request for applications for the Texas Reskilling Support Fund, funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund in the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Dr. Stacy Silverman, Assistant Commissioner for Academic Quality and Workforce, will present this item and be available for questions. Dr. Silverman?
Thank you, Chairman Stedman, and good afternoon, members of the board. The Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board has been awarded $46.5 million in GEAR funding, which will be used to provide financial assistance to Texas students negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The funds will support displaced workers who need to reskill or upskill to quickly return to the workforce, and students who have previously stopped out of higher education institutions without completing a post-secondary credential. The proposed RFA would be competitive and open to all Texas public institutions of higher education. The selection process would place a priority on students pursuing credentials in high-value fields and who are within 12 months of completing their credential. To aid in the development of the allocation and eligibility criteria, which is still being finalized and will be thoroughly detailed in the RFA, the coordinating board staff engaged input from an extensive list of stakeholders, which included community colleges, the Texas State Technical College System, public regional universities, and employer representatives. The plan is to issue the RFA in the coming weeks, with the selection of grant awards to be completed this fall. The staff recommendation is for approval.
Have any questions? I guess I do have a question. So if this is for the current biennium, right?
Yes, it is.
Correct.
So the
That's
funds
correct.
will have to, so that you guys need to get to work to get this money out the door.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, may I have a motion to approve the issuance of a request for applications not to exceed $46.5 million for the Texas Reskilling Support Fund, funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund and the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act.
So moved.
So I think I have a motion by Dr. Farias, second by Mr. Wilson. Any further discussion? Members, when I call your name, please state your vote. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Mr. Campbell?
Aye.
Dr. Farias?
Aye.
Mr. Raven?
Aye.
Ms. Swartz?
Aye.
Mr. Torn?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Ms. Williams?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. The motion passes. Item 3D is consideration of approving issuance of a request for offer for the Digital Learning Clearinghouse project funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund in the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Dr. Stacy Silverman, Assistant Commissioner of Academic Quality and Workforce, will present this item and be available for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Stedman. This agenda item is also part of the federal funds awarded by the Governor's GEAR Fund. The remaining agenda items collectively would not exceed $5 million. Approval of agenda item 3D would allow the coordinating board to issue a request for offer for the Digital Learning Clearinghouse project to solicit bids for the design, launch, and upkeep of a website that will curate effective online teaching practices and resources for Texas faculty and instructional support staff. The Digital Learning Clearinghouse will enhance quality online offerings for Texas students impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The coordinating board staff will engage representatives from Texas institutions of higher education, particularly digital learning innovators and student success leaders, to design the specifications of the Digital Learning Clearinghouse funding for the project. And funding for the project will be deployed as quickly as possible in academic year 2021. The staff recommendation is for approval.
So these are just best practices on this website, or they're the actual courses? Yeah. I mean, what do people, why would somebody go there to go to the Digital Clearinghouse?
So Mr. Chairman, so individual campuses and teaching centers and digital learning centers on campus have developed and curated resources that they use to help train faculty in teaching more effectively online and teaching more effectively with technology. Now, our Learning Technology Advisory Committee had for some time been talking about how they might do a better job of sharing these resources across campuses, but they hadn't really had resources to do that. Now, that was all in the pre-COVID world. So these centers that had been supporting maybe a few dozen, or in a few cases, maybe 200 or 300 courses, all of a sudden overnight, they were supporting thousands of courses and faculty who had never taught online before. So, so there's enormous stress on that support infrastructure across the state. So the idea is to provide some targeted resources that can bolster these efforts to train and support faculty in teaching online and teaching effectively with technology, working in close partnership with the institutions.
Okay, so I hate to be a little obtuse here, but if you could give an example, I mean, is that like a history professor, you know, like teaching introductory history course or something like that, or whatever, but teaching, how would that person?
So one example, I can give you an example that honestly I see a lot in my house, just with as my kids' courses were all converted to online, that kind of a natural impulse when folks go to sort of emergency online instruction is they do a lot of like live Zoom lectures. And so they might do like a 45-minute Zoom lecture. And honestly, there are a few people who can captivate an audience for 45 minutes on a Zoom lecture, but that's a pretty small number. And so really what you want to do is you want to approach the design of an effective online class a little bit differently than you would an in-person class. Like aim for videos that are 5 to 7 minutes. Intersperse what you're doing with some interactive elements, some simulations, some knowledge checks, that kind of thing. So, so one example might be to give that history professor maybe a template that he could use to redesign a course that's going to be more effective and more engaging than what he typically do in his in-person classroom.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, because I just didn't know what. Now, of course, you know, I could certainly listen to you for 45 minutes and on a Zoom call, and I would be riveted the entire.
And we've done that a lot. I've got good evidence for that. Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, that sounds like a really good resource. Any other comments?
I was just going to say that I think if there's a silver lining in this pandemic, I think that some of these funding opportunities that are really going to push innovation in this space and be able to scale these solutions and ideas and share it so widespread with the teaching community, not only in Texas, but throughout is really an exciting opportunity. So this is great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so may I have a motion to approve the issuance of a request for offer of a digital learning clearinghouse project funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund in the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act?
So moved. This is Donna.
I think I have a motion by Ms. Williams, a second by Mr. Wilson. If no other discussion, when I call your name, please state your vote. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Mr. Campbell?
Aye.
Dr. Frias?
Aye.
Mr. Raven?
Aye.
Ms. Swartz?
Aye.
Mr. Torn?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Ms. Williams?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. Motion passes. Item 3E1 is consideration of approving the issuance of a request for applications for open educational resources course development and implementation grant program funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund in the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Dr. Stacy Silverman, Assistant Commissioner for Academic Quality and Workforce, will present this item and be available for questions. Stacy?
Thank you, Chairman Stedman. This agenda item is also part of the GEAR funds and would award matching grants to support faculty teams developing new or redesigning open education resources, or OER, for the most frequently transferred Texas core curriculum courses, co-requisite courses, and workforce courses in high-value fields. The grant program is open to Texas public and independent institutions and will help enhance quality online course offerings and reduce the costs of instructional materials for students impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The funding is intended to be deployed to institutions as quickly as possible during the 2021 academic year. The staff recommendation is for approval.
Any comments, questions?
If I could make one comment, Mr. Chairman, because I want to pick up on an important point that Ms. Schwartz made earlier. So one of the mistakes that we made in working on digital learning over the last couple of decades is a lot of great projects were developed that didn't really scale, and where materials weren't really effectively shared across institutions. So in the design of this call for proposals that Stacy just described, we've included some specific elements to increase the likelihood that these materials are going to scale and they're going to be able to be shared across institutions. And so the intent is to get behind our faculty innovators, to encourage them to collaborate with each other across institutions and to accelerate those developments, especially in three key areas. So one would be around those frequently transferred core courses. The second one would be around college readiness materials. And the third one would be around workforce education materials. So if we can target some resources to accelerate the development and improvement and adoption of these resources, then we think we can accelerate the kind of educational innovation that we're seeing on the ground right now, because we have individual faculty, departments, even whole institutions that hadn't much been engaged in online education before, but now that faculty creativity is going in new directions and a lot of exciting work is getting done. So it's important for us to focus some resources and getting behind those faculty innovators and try to accelerate their efforts. And just one other point on this, that fortunately the legislature had provided us with funding in the last biennium for an open educational resources repository that, as you all know, we were able to launch in September 1st. So Ray Martinez and his team, particularly Kyla Torre, did an excellent job of working with our external partners so we could get that repository up and running. So the idea is, let's populate that quickly with resources that are going to be important for students and faculty.
Good stuff. Let's see, may I have a motion to approve the issuance of a request for applications for open educational resource course development and implementation grant program funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund and the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act?
So moved.
Second.
The motion by Dr. Frias, second by Mr. Torn. Members, when I call your name, please state your vote. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Mr. Campbell?
Aye.
Dr. Frias?
Aye.
Mr. Raven? Mr. Raven? You have to unmute.
Aye, sorry.
Mr. Schwartz?
Aye.
Mr. Torn?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Ms. Williams?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. Motion passes. Item 3E2 is consideration of approving the issuance of a request for application for open educational resources technical assistance grant program funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Dr. Stacy Silverman, Assistant Commissioner for Academic Quality and Workforce, will present this item and be available for questions. Stacy.
Thank you, Chairman Stedman. This request for applications would be open to organizations and/or institutions of higher education with demonstrated capabilities to work directly with institutional grantees as technical assistance partners to award grants to promote effective design and enhance scalability of the open educational resources, course development, and implementation grant program. The grant program would help to enhance quality online course offerings and reduce the cost of instructional materials for Texas students impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Similar to the other GEAR-funded grant programs, the OER Technical Assistance Grant Program funding would be deployed as quickly as reasonably possible in the 2021 academic year. The staff recommendation is for approval.
So I guess sort of a broad question. So the GEAR funding comes in. Did you guys, I mean, the coordinating board and commissioner, come up with these kind of strategies and targets, or was that mandated from, say, even Congress?
Yes. So not by Congress. So the GEAR funds are incredibly flexible. So, you know, what a lot of states are doing is they're using the GEAR funds essentially to backfill for other costs or lost revenue. But in Texas, what Governor Abbott and legislative leadership decided to do was prioritize higher ed. First, make sure that we are even on maintaining our financial aid commitments, but then also to make some strategic investments in certain areas. So we've worked closely with the governor's office, with the legislative leadership, and in close consultation with our colleagues in the institutions and the systems to present multiple proposals and options to the legislative leadership. And the items that you see are where they had a strong consensus across the governor's office and the legislative leadership that they wanted to prioritize financial aid and also target funding around improving online teaching and learning, as well as in a later meeting, then we'll talk more about the funding that's targeted for improving our educational and workforce data infrastructure. So the coordinating board's been charged to take the lead on this, but again, working in close consultation and partnership with the state leadership and with our institutions. So we're bringing it to you and on behalf of these conversations, and we continue to work closely with the institutions.
Well, anyway, it's very exciting. It's kind of, not only is there a roadmap that's kind of for the future, you know, what of emphasis in higher education and what needs to be done, but I think your modesty is probably exaggerated. I think I think you and the coordinating board staff, I suspect, I mean, you don't have to comment, probably led the way in the discussion, because these are really important initiatives.
It's been an excellent team effort, and I will say, like, particularly on this one that's before you all right now, I mean, the idea is we do have some institutions that are recognized national leaders on different aspects of digital learning, and so we've consulted with those institutions and about whether they would be able to help coach and support and improve work that other campuses are doing. And so that's what this particular ask is around, is making sure that the development grants that you just approved are going to be of high quality and are going to reflect sound instructional design, and that the technologies that are used are going to reflect the state of the art.
It's great. Let's see, hearing no other questions, may I have a
you know, when Google began to be as big as they did, they had to revive library science because there's so much information, and how do you sort through it? How do teachers effectively identify which resources would be more appropriate for them to use, depending on, like you mentioned, history versus a math teacher, you know, for adult learners or, you know, young learners?
Yeah, that's a significant issue, and across multiple domains. It shows up around resources for advising students, where a lot of students will just go to Google and start Googling around to try to get their questions answered. It shows up when faculty are trying to figure out how they can teach better online. They'll go to Google, start Googling around. And when faculty members are looking for resources for their courses, and this is something I've done many times, you go through a similar process. So one of the things that'll be powerful about the approach that we're taking is you're enlisting broad networks of faculty across multiple institutions as partners and also curators of this kind of information. So the idea is you've got collections of high quality resources that have been vetted by faculty and endorsed by institutions, and also endorsed by individual faculty users. So in our repository, the faculty users will be able to sort of upvote the resources they find especially useful. And having those curated resources is really, really important for folks to be able to have more confidence that what they're working with is accurate and of high quality.
Okay, thank you.
So Mr. Chairman, I wanted to ask the commissioner a question, if I may.
Sure.
Sure. My question is, obviously, the special call board meeting is for these entities to get these authorizations, these applications out. So what kind of timetable are we looking at, Commissioner, in terms of when we were able to get the approval for the gear and these came up? What happens next, I guess, is the question. After the approval by the board on the applications, what is the timetable and what does that look like?
So we'll refine we have to get the institution's time to respond. So we'll refine the proposals quickly, work in close consultation with the institutions, and we should be able to get, as Stacy mentioned, all of the requests for applications out within the next, I'd say 2-3 weeks, depending on how long the conversations go, and with these sort of informal working groups with institutions. And then they'll take, my guess is they'll need 4 to 6 weeks to be able to respond. And then we'll be vetting these and reviewing these as they're coming in, so that we should be able to get the dollars deployed quickly. one of the windows that I'm trying to hit here is making sure that the funding's committed in time so that when as the semester ends, there's a window there where faculty and their students and these faculty support centers have a little more bandwidth. And that's, so we want to be sure that folks know that they've got resources committed, and if they've got additional coaching support, that they've got that available to them before they get to the end of the semester, so that these projects can already be underway in December. And when folks have time over the holidays, they can already be well into their development process.
No, thank you for that, because that's my point. In order for people to plan, that's a good point. I like that. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, so may I have a motion to approve the issuance of a request for applications for the Open Educational Resources Technical Assistance Grant Program funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund and the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act.
So move. This is Donna.
Second by Emma.
Motion by Ms. Williams, second by Ms. Schwartz. Members, when I call your name, please state your vote. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Mr. Campbell.
Aye.
Dr. Frias.
Aye.
Mr. Raven.
Aye.
Ms. Schwartz.
Aye.
Mr. Torn.
Aye.
Mr. Wilson.
Aye.
Ms. Williams.
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. Motion passes. Item 3E3 is consideration of approving the issuance of a request for application for Digital Learning Clearinghouse Grant Program funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund and the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Dr. Stacy Silverman, Assistant Commissioner for Academic Quality and Workforce, will present this item and be available for questions. Stacy? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. This agenda item would allow for the issuance of an RFA that would be available for Texas public institutions of higher education to award matching grants to digital learning and teaching and student success centers to populate a digital learning clearinghouse website with examples of effective online learning practices and other resources for Texas instructors. The Digital Learning Clearinghouse Grant Program seeks to enhance the quality of online course offerings for Texas students impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. As with the other GEAR grant programs, this funding is intended to be deployed quickly and as quickly as reasonably possible during the 2021 academic year. The staff recommendation is for approval.
Any comments or questions? Hearing none, may I have a motion to approve the issuance of a request for application? Anyway, may I have a motion to approve the issuance of a request for applications for Digital Learning Clearinghouse Grant Program funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is one component of the Education Stabilization Fund and the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act?
So moved. Ricky Raven.
Motion by Mr. Raven.
Second.
Second by
Mr. Torn.
Mr. Torn. Let's see, if no further discussion, may, members, when I call your name, please state your vote. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Mr. Campbell?
Aye.
Dr. Frias?
Aye.
Mr. Raven?
Aye.
Ms. Schwartz?
Aye.
Mr. Torn?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Ms. Williams?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. Motion passes. Finally, members, please note that staff requests that items D and E1 through E3 are collectively not to exceed $5 million. Is there a motion to authorize total expenditure not to exceed $5 million for items D and E1 through E3?
So move. This is Donna.
Motion by Ms. Williams,
Second.
second by Dr. Frias. Members, when I call your name, please state your vote. Those in favor say aye, and those opposed say no. Mr. Campbell.
Aye.
Dr. Frias.
Aye.
Mr. Raven.
Aye.
Ms. Swartz.
Aye.
Mr. Torn.
Aye.
Mr. Wilson.
Aye.
Ms. Williams.
Aye.
I vote aye as well. Motion passes. Let's see. Just a comment before we close the board meeting. And I kind of echoed it before, but this is really exciting stuff. It's exciting because not only is our commissioner out in front, leading the way with universities and legislatures and the governor's office in emphasizing priorities that need to be addressed right now. But as I said earlier, I mean this roadmap is and really as Ms. Swartz kind of echoed is a roadmap for the future. All this higher education stuff is changing rapidly before our eyes, and a lot of it's going to be permanent. And to be, and I will say, okay, Nicole made the judgment, our general counsel, that all this stuff needed to be on the agenda. We approved it. It sounds that we approve it. It sounds a little tedious. On the other hand, what a great exposure to kind of what's going on in higher education and what may permanently change in the future. So I really, it was a very interesting, very important board meeting from an educational standpoint for me.
Thank you.
So
Mr. Kelly.
that concludes our special called board meeting. The time is 3:58 p.m. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Motion by Mr. Raven, second.
Second.
Second by Ms. Williams. And we can just say collectively, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I hear none. Motion carries and we are adjourned. Thank you very much for your time. Great meeting.
Bye, everybody. Be
Bye,
safe.
everyone. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.